Millionaire widower swore he'd never love again until he saw his daughter's new nanny. The house was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence you find in a home in harmony, but that cold silence that presses on your shoulders and hangs in the air like a living absence between the walls. That's the sound that had filled Lucio Navarro's penthouse for nearly 5 years. The clock read 6:12 a.m. when he rose, as always, without an alarm. Not because he'd slept well, but because sleep to him was merely a brief pause in the automatic rhythm of his days. He dressed with precision. A crisp white shirt, a grey suit jacket, and his ever-present watch. Everything about Lucio followed a pattern, the pattern of a man who couldn't afford to fall out of line. The housekeeper had already set out coffee on the kitchen table. He sat down alone, always alone, one slice of toast, a sip of black coffee. His gaze drifted over the broad cityscape stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and then, as he did every morning, he avoided glancing at the picture frame turned face down on the corner of the counter. Isadora. Her name still felt too sacred to speak aloud. She'd been gone in an instant, between everything's going to be fine on speakerphone and an eternal silence in the delivery room. In her place, she'd left Mirella, the daughter he loved, with a mixture of guilt and distance. 4 years had passed since that day. 4 long years in which Lucio clung to what he did best: numbers, contracts, control. He avoided the memory. Sometimes he even avoided his own daughter without realizing it. Mirella was growing up under the same roof as him, but in a parallel universe, a world of expensive toys, temporary nannies, and scant affection. No caregiver ever stayed. None were right. The truth was, Lucio had built an invisible barrier between them and the girl. No one was allowed to fill Isadora's place, and until now, no one had dared. "You have a meeting with the Cortec group at 10 a.m., and your flight to Lisbon departs at 4 p.m., Teresa announced as she entered his office. She didn't need permission to enter. Teresa was part of the framework Lucio still maintained. Loyal, efficient, attentive, and worried, though she rarely showed it. By the way," she continued, her voice growing just a bit firmer, "I'll arrange someone new to look after Mirella while you're away." Lucio raised his eyes from the computer screen. "Another nanny?" His tone was flat, neither enthusiastic nor objecting. "Yes, I know none have lasted more than 2 months, but Mirella needs stability. She needs someone who'll actually be there, even when you're not." He said nothing, simply nodded once. Teresa took his silence as permission. "Hire whoever you want," he said, turning back to his monitor. "Just spare me the interview." She left the room with a soft sigh. It wasn't the first time she'd had to handle things for him, but maybe this time could be different. She had something in mind. Meanwhile, up in the penthouse, Mirella sat on the floor in her room, a picture book open in her lap. The last nanny had left 3 days ago, claiming exhaustion. The girl didn't cry or complain. She simply went quiet. Mirella had learned early on that people leave, but outside the colorless routine that ruled their lives, someone was walking straight into them. The next day, Olivia Costa stepped into the building's elevator with a worn backpack slung over her shoulder, her hair gathered in a practical bun, and her heart beating to the rhythm of someone who didn't expect much from life anymore. She wasn't there to change anything. She just wanted to do her job with dignity. When Teresa opened the door, her appraising gaze took in Olivia from head to toe. There was something contained about her. Real. "The house is so quiet," Teresa said, guiding her through the living room. "Too quiet." Olivia simply nodded, taking in the surroundings with quiet curiosity. Sophisticated furniture, expansive windows, but not a single recent photograph. No sign of warmth. Mirella is 4 years old. She's smart but reserved. She doesn't like questions or noise. If you can break through her walls, Teresa paused, it'll be worth it. Olivia smiled softly, not striving for perfection, in no hurry. "I'm not one to rush." Those words echoed in Teresa's mind as she opened the door to Mirella's room. There, on the rug, the little girl flipped through a book about sea creatures. When Olivia knelt beside her and asked if she could sit down, Mirella didn't reply. She only pointed to the empty space next to her, and so it began. No promises, no guarantees, just presence. And unbeknownst to Lucio, his life was about to change forever. Light rain tapped against the penthouse windows when Teresa answered Lucio's call. It was the third day of his trip, and as always, he got straight to the point. "Is Mirella all right?" "She is," she replied firmly. "Eating well, sleeping better. Today, she asked to color." There was a pause on the other end. It was rare for him to ask more than the basics. But that day, the question came, "Did she ask about me?" Teresa looked toward the living room, where Mirella and Olivia sat on the floor surrounded by paper, pencils, and books. The little girl was laughing, not a loud laugh, but a genuine one, of someone unburdened. "No, she hasn't," the secretary answered honestly. "But she's smiling." Across the ocean, Lucio took a moment to reply, as if processing something he didn't know how to name. That morning, Olivia had woken early, though there was no need, an old habit from years of hospital shifts. She made simple coffee, checked that Mirella was still asleep, and used the brief pause to survey the apartment. It was still a cold place, but corners were beginning to show signs of life. A forgotten drawing on the table, a single colorful sock on the couch, a glass with a bit of juice left in the sink. Small traces of a childhood finally starting to unfold. When Mirella woke, she was the one to speak first. "Can we bake a cake today?" Olivia raised her eyebrows in surprise, not at the idea itself, but at it coming from her. The girl almost never suggested anything. She usually just followed along. "Of course we can," she answered with a smile. "What kind of cake?" "Chocolate and flour, lots of it." They laughed and headed to the kitchen. What unfolded over the morning was almost cinematic. Mirella perched on the countertop with her legs swinging and her face smeared with batter. Olivia in a crumpled apron, hair tied up in whatever way held it back, spatula in hand. Amid laughter and little messes, they created more than a cake. They created a moment of true presence. "If you add more milk, it turns into soup," Olivia teased. "Then let's make cake soup," Mirella shouted, giggling. It was at that exact moment the living room door opened. Lucio had landed at the airport that morning without warning. His last meeting in Lisbon was cancelled, and, on impulse, he'd decided to come home early. He didn't call, didn't text. He wanted the silence of his own house, the rigidity of his routine. But what he found when he turned the key was something else, the sound of laughter. He froze for a few seconds, backpack still on his shoulders, coat wet across his back. He walked quietly down the hall to the open-plan kitchen and stopped. His daughter sat on the counter, flour on her cheeks and eyes shining. Beside her, a woman in simple clothes laughed with her, stirring a bowl with mock concentration. It was like watching a movie he didn't remember living, and he felt his chest tighten, not with pain, but with something new or long forgotten, something warm. Then Marina saw him. Her eyes met his above Mirella's head. There was no startle, only surprise. "Mr. Navarro," she said calmly, "we didn't know you'd be back today." He forced a smile. His voice came low. "The meeting was cancelled. I decided to come back early." Mirella turned and beamed. "Daddy, look at our cake." He stepped closer, knelt before his daughter, and wiped the batter off her nose with his thumb. "You look like a professional baker." Olivia washed her hands at the sink, quietly allowing the father-daughter moment to happen. But Lucio looked at her again, and something inside him, something hard and buried, began to stir. That afternoon, he tried to don his armor again. He went up to his office, answered emails, pretended to focus. But all he heard was laughter. All he saw, when he closed his eyes, was Mirella laughing with sticky hands and Olivia with flour smudged across her face. At dinner that evening, he came downstairs to find rice, vegetables, and a roasted fish on the table, simple, fragrant. In the center, a lit candle, a small but powerful gesture. Olivia served the plates without ceremony and then remarked, "I made sure your plate is cilantro-free." Lucio frowned. "I've never said that." Teresa mentioned it in passing, thought better safe than sorry. It was an irrelevant detail. But in this house, where everything was functional and nothing felt tender, details were everything. Later, he passed by his daughter's room. Mirella was laughing while Olivia made funny voices with a toothbrush. Lucio hung back in the doorway, watching. "She got attached so fast," he whispered. Olivia looked up without pausing her playful routine. "Children know when it's safe to attach, even when adults forget how." Lucio felt his chest tighten and had no reply. Lucio Navarro's penthouse seemed transformed. Not the furniture, lights, or colors. Those were the same. It was the air, the atmosphere, the house's vibration. There was a scent of cake in the hallway, subdued laughter in the morning, toys scattered here and there, small footprints on the light rugs. He noticed it all and pretended not to. He worked with his office door cracked open, told himself it was so he could hear Mirella if she needed anything, but deep down, it was just to listen, to hear the sounds that hadn't lived here in so long. That late afternoon, while sorting paperwork, he looked up at the monitor on his desk and saw what seemed impossible. Mirella, climbing into Olivia's lap and dozing off there, her tiny fingers clutching the fabric as if she'd found refuge. Olivia didn't move. She sat on the sofa, still a closed book in her lap, her calm gaze fixed on the window. Lucio paused the video and watched. For a long time. That night, after tucking Mirella into bed, Olivia went to the living room, switched on just a small lamp, and settled on the sofa with a book. She wasn't really reading. It was a habit, an attempt to rest her mind. But in this house, the silence always felt fuller than usual. She didn't expect to see him, yet Lucio appeared barefoot, holding his shirt over his arm and looking visibly tired. "Can't sleep either?" she asked casually. He hesitated for a moment before sitting in the armchair beside her. "Nightmares," he replied, his voice softer than usual. Olivia closed her book slowly. The worst ones mix longing with fear. Lucio stared out the window for a moment. It was rare for anyone to give voice to his pain so precisely. "Sometimes I think I wasn't made for this," he said. "To be a father, to care for someone alone." She crossed her legs carefully. There was no judgment in her eyes, only listening. Everyone thinks that at some point, but what Mirella feels isn't whether you do it right, it's whether you're there. Lucio sighed. His chest felt too heavy for such a silent night. "I look at her and see her mother. Sometimes it makes me angry. And then I hate myself for being angry." The confession came out raw and bitter, settling in the room like something he'd never said aloud. Olivia didn't flinch. She simply pressed her fingers together in her lap and spoke with calm resolve. "It doesn't make you a bad father. It just shows how much you still feel." They sat in silence, a different kind of silence, not uncomfortable but intimate, a safe place where pain could breathe. When he rose to return to the bedroom, he paused in the doorway. "Since you arrived, the house feels less cold." That was all he said, but it was enough. Olivia stayed seated, her heart beating faster than it should. It wasn't passion, at least not yet. It was something rarer, someone seeing her truly for the first time. In the days that followed, Lucio began to watch more, sometimes covertly, other times without bothering to hide. He noticed how patiently Olivia tied Mirella's shoes, how she told the same story 3 times if the little girl asked, how she stood her ground when Mirella threw a tantrum, without yelling, without giving in, but with a respect seldom shown by adults. One afternoon, Lucio stopped by the kitchen and asked what was for dinner. "Chicken and vegetable risotto," Olivia answered. "And a little courage, because today Mirella decided to cut a lock of her own hair." He almost laughed but held back. She gave him a sideways smile, knowing he'd found it amusing even if he didn't admit it. The mood between them was shifting, like the light at dusk. Faint, yet present. A warmth settling in slowly, unobtrusively. And Lucio was beginning to give in. That night, Teresa invited him for a quick chat. She held her tablet, but her gaze was sharp. "Did you see the second quarter reports?" "Yes, they're on target," he replied, distractedly gazing out the window. "And what about the new hire?" He frowned as if he didn't know whom she meant. Teresa arched an eyebrow. "Olivia, sir." "What about her?" "The house has changed. Your daughter has changed, and you have too." He didn't answer immediately, and Teresa didn't expect him to. She simply left a question hanging in the air before departing. The question isn't whether she's good for Mirella. The question is, will you let her be good for you too? Later, on the balcony, Olivia appeared with 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Lucio, who accepted with a slight nod. They stood side by side, looking at the bustling city below. "Where are you from?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Bauru, in the interior of São Paulo," she replied. "And why did you leave nursing?" She paused before answering. "One day, a child died in my arms. I knew it wasn't my fault. But after that, I could never step into a hospital again without feeling like I was suffocating." Lucio looked at her in profile. Her face was calm, but the pain was there, a familiar pain. "Being a nanny may seem like a step back to many people," she continued. "But to me it's like getting to care again, in a simpler way, without losing your soul in the process." He said nothing, but her words struck him powerfully. "I don't know why you came into my life, Olivia," he murmured. "But it doesn't seem like chance." She turned to him, surprised. "Didn't you come to thank me for taking care of your daughter?" Lucio shook his head. "I came to say that you've been taking care of more people than you realize." Olivia didn't know what to say, but at that moment, she knew that something was changing inside him, inside her, in that home, and that no one would emerge unscathed. Soft sunlight filtered through the wide windows of the penthouse as Mirella raced down the stairs, clutching a drawing in her hands. "It's almost time," she announced excitedly. "My birthday!" It was the first time the little girl had counted down the days with such visible anticipation. Before, birthdays were neutral dates. Sure, there were parties planned by Teresa or hired event companies, but Mirella would unwrap expensive gifts, pose for photos, and then retreat back into the silence. This year felt different. Olivia was handling every detail, and Mirella knew it. Together they'd chosen the theme, the cake, the sweets. The girl insisted on being involved in every decision. Even the house seemed to be gearing up. Discreet decorations, bright flowers on the balcony, and the constant scent of vanilla cake in the air. It was as if both the space and the people in it were gently being reorganized. Lucio watched it all with a certain unease. He trusted Olivia enough not to interfere, but there was a restlessness he couldn't quite name. That afternoon, Mirella wore a butterfly costume, sparkling wings, and a floral headband in her hair. She ran up to Lucio and spun in front of him. "Do I look pretty, Daddy?" He hesitated, then bent down. "You look beautiful, Just like your mother when she used to smile like that." Mirella beamed, not fully grasping the weight of the comparison. To her, it was simply affection. To Lucio, it was an echo. Guests began to trickle in. Teresa arrived with her husband. 2 moms from school came with their children. A small gathering, just as Lucio had requested. He disliked crowds, and Olivia respected that. Everything flowed in harmony. Mirella glowed. Olivia moved among the guests with ease, serving treats, organizing toys, adjusting the music softly. Lucio watched from a distance. The way her smile came so naturally, the way she crouched to speak at the children's level. She forced nothing. She simply was. Then the door opened again. A tall, slender man stepped in carrying a hand-wrapped gift. When he saw Olivia, his face lit up. "Gail!" she exclaimed, surprised and delighted. They embraced as if reconnecting after a long friendship. Olivia introduced him as a dear college friend, now a night shift nurse at a public hospital. Lucio, overhearing, didn't react right away, but something twisted in his stomach, a discomfort, as though he no longer belonged in his own home. Gael made himself at ease, joking with Mirella, praising the pistachio brigadeiros, admiring the decor, and Olivia. She laughed with him differently than she did around Lucio. He couldn't name the feeling. All he knew was that it hurt. When the children gathered to open presents, Olivia appeared with 2 cups of soda, handing one to Lucio. "Everything okay?" she asked. He answered too quickly. "Of course." She tilted her head, unconvinced. Before she could press further, Gael reappeared. "Olivia, have you tried the pistachio brigadeiro? It's your favorite," she laughed. "You remember that? How could I forget?" Lucio couldn't stand it. He slipped upstairs in silence, saying nothing. Olivia noticed immediately. Her smile faltered for a moment. She excused herself from Gael and followed him up to the office, where the light was on. She knocked, but didn't wait for an answer. Inside, she found Lucio standing with his back to the window, his fists clenched. "Are you angry?" she asked. He took a moment before replying. "Why would I be? Because a friend of mine showed up at the party, and you didn't like what you saw." He spun around, impatient. "It's not about him. It's about the way you smile at him, like there's some place there where I'm not welcome." Silence stretched between them. Olivia crossed her arms. "Are you jealous?" Lucio looked away, pride stiffening his shoulders. "I thought we were building something." She stepped closer calmly. "We are. But that doesn't mean I'll erase everything I was before you came. I have a history, Lucio. Friends. Memories that shaped me." He ran a hand through his hair, tense. "I just don't know how to handle that. I've never had to compete for anything. But with you, everything feels unstable." "That's because you feel," she said firmly. "You're letting yourself feel, and that's scary." Her voice was gentle, but resolute. "I waited for you that night. Remember, I wouldn't have stayed if it wasn't real." Lucio lowered his gaze. The tension eased slightly. He brushed her arm. "I'm sorry." She nodded. "It's okay to feel jealous, Lucio, but don't push me away for it." He looked at her earnest. "I don't want to lose you, or know someone could take you from me." "No one can take me away from where I choose to be," she replied. And that was it. Nothing more needed to be said. That night, after Mirella drifted off with frosting-smudged hands, Lucio and Olivia sat together on the balcony. They didn't speak of Gael or jealousy, just shared the silence. But now the quiet was theirs, and it no longer felt cold. In the days after the party, Lucio and Olivia spoke few words, but their gestures grew softer. It was as if, even after the tension, they'd reached a new understanding. Mirella remained light-hearted, chattier than ever, sleeping more soundly, calling for Olivia whenever she woke from a bad dream, or simply to be reassured that Olivia was still there. That evening, Lucio arrived home early from work, resolved to talk to Olivia. Not to declare all his feelings once and for all, but to tell her that she was part of his life now, that he couldn't imagine this home without her and without Mirella's bright eyes. He rehearsed every sentence in his head when Teresa entered the office holding an envelope. "This just arrived," she said gravely. "It's in your name." He took the thick, official-looking envelope and read the first line, then the second. He froze, the air rushing from his lungs, his grip tightening on the paper. It was a legal summons. Isadora's mother, whom he hadn't spoken to since the funeral, was petitioning for custody of Mirella. She accused him of emotional abandonment, domestic instability, and undue influence by the caregiver, Olivia. Teresa noticed the change in his eyes, the swift transformation from a man who'd walked these halls lighter than ever just days ago to one sinking back into despair. "Did Olivia know?" he asked in a low, trembling voice. Teresa hesitated. "She found the papers yesterday in the building's mailroom. She asked me not to tell you until after your meeting today." Lucio ground his teeth, hurt, cutting deep. She'd known and hid it. The trust he'd started to build slipped through his fingers like sand. He stormed down the stairs, footsteps heavy, and found Olivia in the kitchen slicing fruit for Mirella's dinner. She looked up at him and instantly understood. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. She set the knife down slowly. "Because I thought I needed time, that it wasn't the right moment. You thought?" he interrupted. "You're not family, Olivia. It's not your place to decide when I need to worry." Her face fell more than she'd expected. "I stayed because I love this child, because she trusts me, because you trusted me." "I did," he said, stepping back. "And maybe that was a mistake." The ground shifted beneath her. "You don't believe in me?" He looked away. "I don't know." Those words shattered her. He still didn't know how to trust, still didn't know how to love without protecting himself first. "Then I can't stay," she said. She left the kitchen in firm steps, her heart breaking. That night, Mirella searched for Olivia to share a dream but couldn't find her. Teresa said she'd gone to rest early. A white lie. The little girl fell asleep more restless than usual. Lucio tried to work, but the summons words struck him like blows. Emotionally unstable environment. Inappropriate authority figure. But what echoed most was how Olivia looked at him before she left. Not angry, but in pain. The next morning the kitchen was empty. Teresa prepared breakfast in silence. Mirella came down in her pajamas, dragging her teddy bear. "Has Olivia gone?" she asked. Teresa froze. The girl repeated the question. "She left early," Teresa said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Mirella wilted. She sat at the table without a word. She didn't cry, but she didn't eat either. Lucio stayed in his office all day, ignored calls and emails, just stared at the photo frame he always kept face down. This time he turned it over. Isadora smiled in the photo, pregnant, radiant. He studied it for long minutes and finally realized it wasn't Isadora keeping him from moving forward. It was the fear of failing again. He'd failed Isadora by not being there at her birth, and now he was failing Mirella and Olivia. That night, there was no bedtime story. Mirella turned to the wall in silence. Lucio sat beside her, running his fingers through her fine hair. For the first time in years, he wept silently, not for what he'd lost, but for choosing absence again. He knew that this time there was still time to make it right. But time would not wait much longer. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual. It wasn't a matter of temperature, but of absence. Mirella woke up early, quietly. She sat at the table and stared at the plate of bread and fruit that Teresa had prepared. She said nothing. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for more. She simply sat there, her eyes drifting between the food and the closed door of the hallway, half expecting Olivia to appear, smiling as she always did. But she didn't come. Lucio spent the entire day in his office pretending to work. His computer screen displayed charts and reports, but he didn't see any of it. His thoughts kept returning to the hallway of the night before, to Olivia's expression, to the last thing she said without words, and to his own cowardice. It wasn't the first time he'd pushed someone away, but this time it hurt differently, because it was no longer just about him. It was about Mirella, and about what had finally begun to bloom, and that he, out of fear, had crushed with his own hands. That evening, Teresa came into his office carrying a folder, but when she saw him staring at the photo frame with a distant look, she hesitated. "Any news on the custody case?" he asked without taking his eyes off the picture. "The lawyer says it's more of a pressure tactic than anything solid. The grandmother doesn't have a strong case." "But she has intent," he murmured. "And that was enough to make me destroy everything." Teresa stepped closer. "Lucio," she said gently, "you spent years just surviving, and then all of a sudden you started living again. Do you know what that means?" He didn't answer. He just propped his elbows on the desk and buried his face in his hands. Teresa took another step forward. "Mirella calls you Daddy, but Olivia, she taught Mirella to see you as a father, and she taught you, without you realizing it, how to be one." Lucio looked up, his eyes glistening, his jaw tight. "Do you think it's too late?" Teresa smiled with tenderness. "If it were, I wouldn't have brought this." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag, a school pamphlet. In the corner, a handwritten note, Olivia's name, a phone number and an address, a neighborhood school where she dropped off her resume as a teaching assistant. I asked around where she went. She wouldn't tell me, but she left this on the table. I think she wanted to be found. Without thinking, Lucio grabbed his keys and drove off. It was still early, but he felt that if he waited another day, he'd lose the only chance he had left. The neighborhood was modest, the streets narrow. The school had a faded green gate with a welcome banner tied on with twine. Children played in the courtyard, and there, sitting on a little wooden stool, surrounded by small, attentive listeners, was Olivia. Book in hand, hair in a loose bun, wearing a simple blouse, and that calm look of someone who's faced many internal battles. Lucio stopped at the gate, as if those 2 meters were an abyss. She didn't notice him at first, but when her eyes finally locked onto his, something froze. Time, sound, pain. A few minutes later, she emerged from the classroom. Her steps were slow. There was no anger on her face, but there was caution. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly. Lucio met her gaze with raw honesty. "I didn't come on impulse. I came by choice." Her brow furrowed slightly. He went on. "I was afraid of getting attached, of losing someone again, of hurting you. But the biggest mistake was pretending nothing was happening just because it was too hard to deal with what I was feeling." Olivia crossed her arms, trying to contain her emotions. "You pushed me away. You said trusting me might have been a mistake." "And it was," he interrupted. "But not your fault. It was my mistake, for taking so long to understand that you never wanted to replace anyone. You only wanted to be." She looked down and took a deep breath. "And now?" Lucio took a step closer. "Now I don't want Mirella growing up remembering you as just a phase, and I don't want to spend another day pretending I don't care, because I do care about you, about her, about what we've built. I love you, Olivia." The words came out light, a relief, a truth finally spoken. She brought her hand to her mouth, surprised. Tears glistened in her eyes. "You don't know if you'll be able to make this work." "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I want to try. With you, in our own time." At that moment, a car pulled up around the corner. The door opened and Mirella jumped out, running toward them. "Olivia!" Olivia wrapped her daughter in a tight hug. "Now can you stay forever?" Olivia looked at Lucio. He reached out his hand, steady. "If it's together, I'll come back," she said, her voice trembling. And there, on the sidewalk, with the distant laughter of children playing behind them, 3 wounded lives finally found shelter in one another. Not a perfect ending, but a true beginning. Back home, the kitchen smelled of warm bread and fresh coffee. Morning sunlight streamed through the window as though finally allowed to light every corner of a house that had long lived in emotional shadow. Mirella sat at the table, swinging her feet in the air, humming a song she'd learned at school. Lucio stood beside her, peeling a tangerine with clumsy patience. Across from him, Olivia placed 2 rolls in the oven, smiling quietly at the scene. "You're doing it wrong, Daddy. You have to pull with your thumb," Mirella instructed with the authority of someone who knows everything about fruit. Lucio raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? And where'd you learn that?" "Olivia taught me." "Then you're right," he replied, smiling. The ease with which they exchanged these lines was the biggest change of all. The affection was there, in every small gesture, in the quick glances, in the silences filled with presence. It had been 2 weeks since their reunion, since, if it's together. Nothing extraordinary had happened since then, and that was exactly what made it so extraordinary. They were living under one roof again, but to new rhythms. Olivia wasn't just the nanny anymore. She was part of the family, of the routine, of the warmth. There were still adjustments to be made, fears that surfaced at unexpected times, but now the 3 of them knew exactly where they stood, on the shifting ground of honesty. One rainy night, Lucio invited Olivia to watch a movie. She sat beside him on the couch, and for a while neither spoke. "When Isadora died, I lost myself completely," he confessed. "I didn't know how to love without feeling guilty. But with you, I relearned that loving also means losing the fear of living." Olivia rested her head on his shoulder. "Loving is not running away when someone shows you their cracks." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you for staying, even when I didn't know I wanted you to." "And thank you for letting me be just me," she replied. Rain tapped gently on the window. Mirella slept in her room, arms spread, breathing softly. The house was at peace. The following Sunday, they set out early for a trip to the park. Lucio carried Mirella's bicycle in the trunk, complaining about the crooked handlebars. Olivia carried the cooler bag with fruit, water, and a blanket. Mirella rode in the back seat, buzzing about how butterflies would fly close to her because she was magical. As they wandered through the park, laughing at Mirella's stories, Lucio glanced at Olivia. Her hair was down, her eyes closed against the sun, a gentle smile on her face. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was calm, she was home. He wondered for a moment if Isadora would be happy to see them like this. And in that quiet thought, he believed she would be. Because, in the end, life is made of this. Departures that hurt, reunions that heal, and choices that take courage. And they had chosen to stay, together, in imperfection, in truth, in the home that finally knew what it meant to be a real home. If this story warmed your heart even a little, leave a heart in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. Your support helps me keep sharing what the world needs to feel.